Sheriff Dallas arrested the same woman 3 times in 6 months, and every time she vanished from his jail cell before the sun came up. She was Japanese, the first anyone in that territory had ever seen, with jet black hair pinned in a traditional knot and a lacquered box she wouldn't let go of even in chains. The town wanted her hanged for horse theft, the one crime the frontier wouldn't forgive, but every time Dallas put iron on her wrists, he saw something that didn't fit the crime at all. Before this story begins, stay until the very end to see how it unfolds. And if it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge when Dallas rode up on the campsite. A small fire burned down to embers near a stand of cottonwood trees, and a bay mare stood ground hitched to a mesquite bush, saddled and ready to travel. The woman crouched beside the fire with one hand on the mare's flank and the other holding a piece of flatbread she had been eating for breakfast. She didn't run or reach for a weapon, just stood up slowly, brushed the dust from her knees, and waited. She was small-framed, maybe 5 feet tall, with jet black hair pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her skull and almond-shaped dark eyes that caught the early light like polished river stones. Her skin was fair, her cheekbones high and sharp, and she wore a kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, the deep indigo silk visible at her collar and wrists, in a territory where no one had ever seen a garment like it. In her left hand she carried a lacquered wooden box, small enough to fit inside a saddlebag, but clearly older than anything else she owned, the kind of object that had crossed an ocean with someone who had no intention of letting it go. She held it against her ribs the way a soldier holds his rifle. Dallas had been sheriff of Bitter Springs for 4 years, long enough to know that horse thieves came in 2 varieties, the kind who ran and the kind who begged. This woman did neither. She stood in the morning cold with the bay mare behind her and the fire dying at her feet and looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. It was not fear. It was not defiance. It was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, and it made the hair on his arms stand up because he had seen that look exactly once before on a man about to hang. He dismounted and pulled the iron from his belt. She extended her wrists without being asked, the lacquered box balanced on her forearm, and the cuffs closed around her slender wrists with a click that sounded too loud for the quiet morning. The bay mare shifted, but didn't spook, and Dallas noticed that the horse was calm under her hand, not because it was broken, but because it trusted her. He had been around horses his whole life, and he knew the difference. The ride back to Bitter Springs took 3 hours, and she didn't speak a single word the entire way. She sat the horse with perfect posture, her spine straight, her chin level, the lacquer box resting in her lap, and every time Dallas glanced at her, he felt the same wrongness in his chest. Horse thieves didn't sit like that. Horse thieves didn't carry themselves like they were riding to an audience with someone who mattered. She held herself like a woman who had been taught from childhood that posture was a form of honor. And honor was the one thing no one could take from you, not even a sheriff with a 10-star and a pair of iron bracelets. Bitter Springs was a town of 400 souls, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, and a jail. That consisted of 2 iron bar cells in the back room of Dallas's office. When he walked her through the front door, the barber looked up from the chair on the boardwalk, and the general store owner stopped sweeping his porch. Neither of them had ever seen a Japanese woman before. Neither of them had ever seen a kimono. They stared at her the way people stare at something they cannot categorize, with a mixture of confusion and something close to fear, and Dallas felt the town's attention settle on her like dust, settling after a stampede. He locked her in the back cell and took the iron off her wrist. She sat on the cot with her back against the wall, one hand resting on her knee and the other resting on the lacquered box, and she looked at him through the bars with those dark eyes and didn't say a word. He stood there for a long moment, searching for something to say, and found nothing. He had arrested 47 men in 4 years as sheriff, and not one of them had left him speechless. He went back to his desk and pulled out the warrant book and wrote her name down. Honoka. She had given it to the circuit judge in the next county when she was briefly held there 2 months prior, and the clerk had passed it along. 1 word, 5 syllables, and it sat on the page like a puzzle with missing pieces. He closed the book and leaned back in his chair and told himself she was just another horse thief. He told himself that twice, because once wasn't enough to believe it. That night, the kerosene lantern on his desk burned low, throwing a flickering amber light across the office that made the shadows on the wall move like breathing things. Dallas hadn't slept in 2 days, tracking a cattle rustler north of the creek before catching the report on Noka, and his body gave out around midnight. He put his head on his arms, and the next thing he knew, the gray light of dawn was cutting through the front window, and the cell behind him was empty. He stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. The iron bars were intact, the lock was still latched, but the cell was vacant. The blanket was folded on the cot, with edges so precise they looked starched. The tin cup was washed and placed upside down on the floor beside the cot, and the wash basin had been emptied and wiped dry. She had cleaned the cell before she left, and the absurdity of that fact hit him harder than the escape itself. The lock on the office front door was picked, a thin piece of wire still lodged in the keyhole, and the back window was unlatched from the inside. She had lifted the iron bar from the cell door using a tool he couldn't identify, picked the office door with a wire she had fashioned from something in the cell, and slipped out the back window into the alley without making enough noise to wake a man sitting 10 feet away. The skill and patience required for that sequence staggered him. He walked to the livery and found the bay mare gone. But the liveryman, a man named Hodges, who kept poor records and poor feed, was shouting about a second horse missing from his stable. A black gelding that belonged to a ranch hand named Polk, a man known around town for whipping his animals when they didn't move fast enough to suit him. Dallas stood in the empty stall and looked at the trampled hay and thought about the coincidence of a horse thief who stole 2 horses, and one of them belonged to a man who beat his animals. He filed it away without knowing why. The town didn't let him forget it. The barber told the story at the saloon that night, and by the next morning, every man in Bitter Springs knew that the sheriff had been outsmarted by a woman half his size who cleaned the cell on her way out. Dallas took the ribbing with his jaw set and said nothing, because the thing that bothered him wasn't the embarrassment. The thing that bothered him was the folded blanket and the washed cup and the look in her eyes when he put the iron on her wrists. She hadn't been afraid of the jail because she had never intended to stay. 3 weeks passed before he saw her again. A rancher named Pruitt rode in from his spread north of town, spitting mad about 2 horses stolen from his corral in the night, and the description of the thief matched no one Dallas had ever arrested except one. Pruitt was a big man with a red face and a temper that matched it, and he leaned across the sheriff's desk and said the word hanging 3 times in the same sentence. Dallas listened, pulled his hat off the hook, and rode out alone. He found her at a creek crossing 12 miles north, walking 2 horses toward higher ground. She wasn't rushing them. She moved alongside the older horse with her hand on its neck, guiding it with a quiet confidence that showed she understood horses better than most ranchers in the territory. And the animals followed her, not because they were trained to, but because they wanted to. The bay mare from the first arrest wasn't with her. These were 2 different horses, both underweight, both with ribs showing through dull coats. She saw him when he was still 200 yards out, and she stopped. She didn't run. and she didn't reach for anything. She stood in the creek bed with the water around her boots and the 2 horses behind her, and waited for him to close the distance. And when he dismounted and walked toward her, she extended her wrists the same way she had the first time, the lacquered box balanced on her forearm. Then she spoke. It was the first time he had heard her voice, and it was lower than he expected. Quiet and steady, each word placed with the same care she used with the horses. They were starving. 4 words, and they landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He looked at the 2 horses, their protruding ribs and dull coats, and he looked at her, and he put the iron on her wrist because that was his job. But the 4 words stayed in his head for the entire ride back, and he turned them over and over, the way a man turns over a coin he cannot identify. The ride back was different from the first arrest. She sat the horse with that same perfect posture, but this time she watched him, and he was aware of her gaze in a way that made the back of his neck warm. Something passed between them on that ride that he couldn't name, not love, not even trust, but a recognition. 2 people who both understood what it meant to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves. He had been sheriff long enough to know that most people existed in a web of obligations and debts and favors, and the ones who stood outside that web were either very dangerous or very lonely. He wasn't sure which she was, and he wasn't sure which he was either. The town was waiting when they rode in, and the mood had shifted. 2 arrests meant a pattern, and a pattern meant the sheriff couldn't hold a prisoner, and a sheriff who couldn't hold a prisoner was no sheriff at all. The barber stood on his boardwalk with his arms crossed, and the general store owner was talking to 2 men Dallas didn't recognize, and the word posse floated across the street like a stray dog looking for a home. Dallas heard it and felt the ground shift under his boots. Horse theft was the one crime the frontier wouldn't forgive. A stolen horse could mean death for a homesteader, stranded without transport, and the men who settled this territory didn't forget that kind of danger between the end of the war and the turn of the decade. Vigilante groups across the Western Territories had hanged more than 100 horse thieves, and the law had looked the other way because the law understood that some crimes were too personal for a judge and a jury. Dallas knew this. He also knew that the woman in his cell wasn't what she appeared to be, and the gap between what she appeared to be and what she actually was the only thing standing between her and a rope. He put an extra lock on the cell, this time a heavy padlock he had ordered from Denver the year before and never needed. He sat across from her through the night with his chair tilted against the wall and his rifle across his knees, and the kerosene lantern threw its amber light across the bars and made the shadows on her face shift and change. She sat on the cot with the lacquered box in her lap, and he looked at the box and then at her and asked the question he had been carrying since the first arrest. "What is in the box?" She didn't answer. She looked at him with those dark eyes, and the lamplight caught the sharp line of her cheekbones and the straight fall of her jet black hair where it had come loose from the knot during the ride, and he felt something crack inside his chest that he didn't have a name for. He hadn't expected that. He had expected fear or defiance or the blank resignation of a criminal caught for the second time, and instead he got silence and a look that said she would tell him when she was ready and not 1 second before. He didn't ask again. He sat in the chair and she sat on the cot, and the night stretched out between them like a held breath. And somewhere outside, a dog barked, and the wind pushed against the building, and the town of Bitter Springs settled into the kind of quiet that made every sound feel like a warning. The deputy came in around midnight, holding his right arm against his body with his left hand, blood seeping through his fingers and dripping on the floorboards in a pattern that looked like Morse code. His name was Cooper, young, 3 months on the job, and a horse had kicked him during the commotion When Pruitt brought his complaint to the sheriff's office and the crowd pressed in around the cells, the gash on his forearm was deep, running from his wrist to his elbow, and the flesh around it was already swelling and turning the color of thunderclouds. Dallas grabbed the cleanest cloth he had and pressed it against the wound, but the blood came through fast, and Cooper's face went white and then gray. The nearest doctor was in Silver Creek, 3 hours by horse in the dark, and the wound wouldn't wait that long. Dallas had seen enough injuries on the frontier to know the smell that came when a wound went bad, and the smell was already starting. Then Anoka spoke from behind the bars. 2 words, quiet and clear, the same low voice that had said they were starving on the creek bed. "Let me." Dallas looked at her. She was standing at the cell door with the lacquered box open in her hands, and inside it he saw things he couldn't identify. Needles so fine they caught no light, arranged in a row on a silk cloth. Small paper packets of dried herbs, each one folded with a precision that reminded him of the folded blanket and the washed cup. A square of clean cotton, a small stone mortar and pestle no bigger than his fist. He unlocked the cell. He told himself it was because Cooper needed help, and the doctor was too far away, and that was true, but it wasn't the only reason. He unlocked the cell because he wanted to see what was in the box and what she would do with it, and the curiosity was stronger than his judgment, and he knew it. She knelt beside Cooper and took his arm with a gentleness that contradicted everything the town believed about her. She washed the wound with water from the basin, then selected 3 needles from the box and placed them along the gash at points Dallas couldn't follow, each one sliding into the skin with a touch so light that Cooper didn't flinch. She mixed herbs from 2 of the paper packets in the stone mortar, added water, and spread the paste along the wound with her fingertips, and the smell that came from the paste was sharp and green and nothing like the smell of infection. Cooper's face changed. Dallas watched it happen. The tight lines of pain around his eyes loosened, the gray color receded, and his breathing slowed from shallow gasps to something steady and deep. The swelling didn't disappear, but it stopped growing, and the blood slowed to a seep. Dallas had expected superstition, some ritual passed down through a family that didn't know better, and what he saw instead was skill, discipline, and the kind of knowledge that took a lifetime to acquire. The same hands that had picked his lock and calmed wild horses were saving his deputy's arm, and the frontier had no frame for it because the frontier had never seen anything like it. She repacked the box with the same care she had unpacked it, each needle returned to its place, each paper packet refolded, the mortar wiped clean with the cotton cloth. She closed the lid, and the latch clicked, and she picked up the box and placed it back against her ribs and walked to the cell without being told. Dallas locked the door behind her and stood there looking at his hands, which were stained with Cooper's blood and the green paste, and he didn't know what to say. Cooper slept through the rest of the night on a bedroll by the stove, and when the doctor arrived from Silver Creek at dawn, he examined the wound and the dried paste on it and asked who had treated it. Dallas told him. The doctor was quiet for a long time, turning Cooper's arm in the morning light, and then he said he had never seen infection turn back like that, not in 20 years of practice on the frontier and in the army. He asked what was in the paste. Dallas said he didn't know. The doctor looked at the cell where Hanoka sat, with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed and the lacquered box in her lap, and he shook his head slowly and didn't ask anything else. Dallas stood at his desk and watched the doctor ride out, and the town wake up, and the sun climb over the ridge, and the thing that cracked in his chest the night before cracked a little wider. She wasn't just a horse thief. She was someone with skills the frontier desperately needed, and the town that wanted to hang her didn't know what she could do. And the gap between what she was and what they thought she was had become a canyon he couldn't see across. What he didn't know was that the canyon was about to get deeper, and the choice between the law and everything else was about to become impossible to avoid. Morning light came through the front window onto an empty cell. The padlock lay on the floor, open with a tool she had fashioned from the tin-cup handle, bent and shaped into a pick during the hours when he had been focused on Cooper's arm. The blanket was folded, the cup was washed, the basin was dry. She had left the cell cleaner than she found it, and this time she left something else. On the cot, where the blanket had been folded, sat a small paper packet of dried herbs with a piece of cloth tied around it. Written on the cloth in careful English, the letters slightly uneven, the grammar not quite right, but the meaning unmistakable. For the deputy, 3 days, no infection. Dallas picked up the packet and turned it in his fingers, and the herb smelled like the paste she had spread on Cooper's arm, sharp and green and alive. He put it in his vest pocket and didn't tell anyone about it. He told the barber she had picked the padlock and vanished during the night, which was true, and he didn't mention the herbs or the note, which was a choice he made, standing in the empty cell with the morning light on his face and the taste of a lie already forming in his mouth. She was gone, and so were 3 horses this time, all from Pruitt's Spread, the ranch north of town where the animals were worked, to foundering, and the fence wire was barbed and rusted. Pruitt rode in spitting fire and talking about ropes and trees, and Dallas listened and nodded and said he would track her, and then he saddled his horse and rode out alone. He told himself he was going to arrest her. He told himself that twice, the way he had told himself she was just a horse thief, and it worked about as well the second time. He followed the hoof prints north through scrub country for 6 hours, past the creek crossing where he had arrested her the second time, past the cottonwood stand where he had found her the first time, up into the hills where the ground turned rocky and the trail narrowed and the wind carried the smell of pine and cold water. The box canyon was tucked behind a ridge of red sandstone, invisible from below, accessible only through a narrow cut between 2 rock walls that a horse could barely pass through single file. He dismounted and led his horse through the narrow passage and stepped out into a space that should not have existed, a hidden valley with a spring at the far end and good grass on the slopes and brush shelters built along the eastern wall for shade. The horses were there, all of them. The bay mare from the first arrest, the black gelding from the second, the 2 from Pruitt's Spread, and 3 more he didn't recognize. 6 horses total, grazing on the good grass or standing in the shade of the brush shelters she had built with her own hands. Their coats were shining, their ribs were covered, and their hooves were trimmed. These weren't stolen horses being held for ransom or sale. These were rescued horses being nursed back to health by a woman who couldn't stand to watch them suffer. The mystery box cracked open. She wasn't a thief. She was a woman who had looked at the frontier and seen animals being beaten and starved and worked to death, and the frontier had no law for that, so she had made her own. Dallas stood in the canyon with the sun on his face and the sound of horses grazing around him, and the understanding landed in his chest like a fist. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple, and simple things hit harder when you have been looking in the wrong direction. Then he heard movement behind him. He turned, and she was standing at the mouth of the cut 10 feet away with a naginata in her hands. It was a long polearm with a curved blade at the end, a weapon he had never seen before, and she held it resting on the ground with the blade angled away from him, not raised, not threatening, just present. She was making a point because she could have used it, but she chose not to. The blade caught the sunlight, and she looked at him across the distance and waited for him to decide what he was going to do. He looked at her, and then at the horses, at the shelters, and the spring and the trimmed hooves and the shining coats, and he turned his horse around and led it back through the passage without saying a word. He rode back to Bitter Springs and told Pruitt and the barber and the general store owner that he had lost the trail in the rocks. It was the second lie he had told for her, and the second time the taste of it sat in his mouth like copper, and the second time he would do it again without thinking twice. What he didn't know was that Pruitt wasn't the kind of man who accepted losing, and the rope would come off the saddle horn soon enough. 2 weeks passed, and the town didn't forget. Pruitt wasn't the kind of man who let things go, and the loss of 5 horses from his spread had turned him from angry into something colder and more patient. He talked to the men who drank at the saloon on Saturday nights, and the talking turned to planning, and the planning turned to a posse of 5 men who rode out of Bitter Springs on a Tuesday morning with rope and a purpose. Dallas heard about it from Cooper, who had heard it from the liveryman, who had heard it from the barber. 5 men, Pruitt leading, armed, heading north, to find the horse thief and string her up from the nearest cottonwood. Horse theft was a hanging crime in practice, if not in law, and the territory had a long history of men who took justice into their own hands when the courts were too slow or the sheriff too soft. Dallas saddled his horse and rode hard, pushing the animal faster than he should have, because the posse had a 2-hour head start and he knew where they were going. He found Anoka first. She was at the edge of town, on foot, leading a lame horse away from a small farm south of the creek. The horse was favoring its left front leg, and she had it draped in a makeshift splint made from strips of wood and her own cloth, and she was walking it slowly toward the hills with the patience of someone who had done this a dozen times before. She had come back instead of running, had seen one more horse that needed help, and walked straight into the place where the posse was looking for her. Dallas rode up between her and the road. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the lame horse stood between them, breathing hard, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the sound of hooves came from the south, and Pruitt and his 5 men appeared on the ridge with the sun behind them, and the rope was already coiled around Pruitt's saddle horn. He arrested her in front of the posse. He dismounted, pulled the iron from his belt, and put it on her wrists, while Pruitt watched from his horse with a face like a closed fist. Dallas stood between Hanoka and the rope and said she was in his custody and she would go through the court when the circuit judge arrived, and the words came out steady and flat with no inflection, because if his voice cracked even a little, the men on that ridge would hear it and know that the sheriff wasn't doing his job. He was doing something else. Pruitt said the judge wasn't coming for 3 weeks. Dallas said 3 weeks wasn't long to wait. Pruitt said he wasn't waiting. Dallas put his hand on his revolver and told Pruitt to try something, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses against your chest and makes the air thick. Pruitt looked at the revolver, and then at Dallas, and then at the 5 men behind him, and not one of them moved, because the sheriff of Bitter Springs had a reputation that wasn't built on bluffing. Pruitt turned his horse and rode back toward town, and the 5 men followed him, and the rope stayed coiled on his saddle horn. This was the 3rd arrest, and the town was watching. Dallas locked her in the cell, with both locks and the padlock and the iron bar, and he sat across from her, with the rifle across his knees and the kerosene lantern burning between them, and the night stretched out like a wire pulled tight. The posse had backed down, but Pruitt had given him 3 days. After that, the rope came off the saddle horn, and the law became whatever 5 men with a grudge said it was. She spoke. Not about the horses, not about the arrest, not about the posse or the rope or the 3 days. She spoke about Kyoto, the city where she was born, the city her grandmother had lived in for 70 years practicing the medicine that filled the lacquered box. She told it in fragments, not a story with a beginning and a middle, but pieces of a life that had broken apart somewhere between Japan and this territory. A family lost to illness that the medicine couldn't cure. a duty to her grandmother's skills that she carried across the Pacific to a place that had no use for what she knew and no walls to keep her. Dallas listened. He didn't interrupt. He sat in the chair with the rifle across his knees and the amber light on the bars, and he listened to her talk about a world he had never seen and a life he couldn't imagine. And the woman he had arrested 3 times became someone he didn't recognize. Not because she had changed, but because he had finally stopped looking at her through the bars of what he expected her to be. She had never been who anyone thought she was. The town saw a horse thief, Pruitt saw prey, the barber saw a curiosity. Dallas had seen a criminal, then a mystery, then a healer, and now he saw something else. Something that sat in the center of his chest like a coal that wouldn't go out. He didn't name it. Naming it would make it real, and real things could be taken away. That night she escaped for the 3rd time. But this time the cell door was unlocked. The padlock lay on the floor, open, the key still in it. The office front door was unlatched. The back window was closed. Dallas sat at his desk with his hat over his face and his boots on the desk and his rifle leaning against the wall. And when the first gray light of dawn came through the window, the cell was empty and the blanket was folded and the cup was washed and the lacquered box was gone. He had left the way open, or he had chosen not to hear her. The difference between those 2 things was the width of a hair, and he didn't try to split it. Dawn brought the posse to his door. Pruitt was in the lead with the rope, and the 5 men behind him with their rifles, and they pushed into the office and found the empty cell and the unlocked padlock, and the sheriff sitting at his desk with his hat in his hands. Dallas told them she had picked the locks again, all 3 of them, in the dark. While he slept, Pruitt looked at the padlock with the key still in it, and his eyes narrowed, and Dallas looked back at him with a face that gave nothing away, and the moment held for 3 seconds that felt like 30. Pruitt called him a liar. Dallas stood up from his chair and told Pruitt to say it again, and the office went quiet, and Pruitt didn't say it again. He turned and walked out, and the 5 men followed him, and the rope was still coiled on his saddle horn, and the 3 days were up, and the town of Bitter Springs went back to its business with the tension of a wire that has been stretched past its limit and hasn't yet snapped. Dallas waited 1 day. He spent it at his desk doing nothing, staring at the wall where the shadow of the cell bars fell in the afternoon light. And Cooper asked him twice if he was all right, and he said yes, both times, and meant it neither time. On the morning of the 2nd day, he hitched a bugboard, loaded it with feed bags, and a water barrel, and a roll of canvas, and a coil of rope, and rode out alone toward the hills. The buckboard was the working vehicle of the frontier, a flat-bedded wagon built for hauling feed and fence posts and everything that needed moving. Not a carriage for passengers, but the pickup truck of its day, and the wheels creaked on the rocky trail as he drove it up through the cut in the sandstone and into the box canyon. The horses were there, all of them, grazing on the slopes, and the shelters stood against the eastern wall, and the spring ran clear and cold at the far end. She was at the spring, kneeling beside a colt that lay on a bed of canvas. The colt's left hind leg was splinted with strips of wood and cloth, and the lacquered box was open on a flat rock beside her, with the needles arranged in a row and the paper packets of herbs spread out. She was washing the splint with water from the spring, and the colt was calm under her hands, its breathing slow and steady, its eyes half closed, and Dallas watched her work and understood something he hadn't understood before. Animals trusted her because she had never given them a reason not to, and that trust was the same thing that made the horses follow her out of Pruitt's corral and into the hills without resistance. She didn't steal them. She called them and they came. He dismounted from the buckboard and unloaded the feed bags and the water barrel and the canvas, and he set them down near the brush shelters without saying a word. She watched him from the spring, her hand still on the colt's leg, her dark eyes tracking his movements, and he didn't explain what he was doing because the act was the explanation. He hauled water to the trough she had built from flat stones. He mended a section of brush fence that the wind had loosened. He spread the canvas over a frame of cottonwood poles to make a second shelter, and the work was simple and hard and exactly the kind of work that didn't need talking. They worked side by side in the canyon for 3 hours without speaking. He held a horse while she treated its hooves with a small knife from the box, trimming the overgrown walls with the same precision she used on the needles. He carried water from the spring in the bucket she had fashioned from a lard can and a length of rope. He stacked feed where the horses could reach it, and she moved among them with her hand on each neck, checking eyes and teeth and legs, and the afternoon sun moved across the canyon floor, and the shadows lengthened, and the horses grazed in the quiet. In the back of his mind, he could hear Pruitt's voice talking about ropes and trees, and he knew that what he was doing in this canyon wasn't just labor, but a kind of bet, wagering everything he had built in 4 years as sheriff on a woman he had arrested 3 times and a canyon full of horses that the law said. He spoke first. He was leaning against the sandstone wall with his hat pushed back and his arms folded, watching her wrap the colt's leg with a fresh strip of cloth, and the words came out before he could stop them. "I can't keep arresting you." She didn't look up from the colt. Her hands kept working, pressing the cloth smooth, tying the knot with one pull. "Then don't." 3 words, and they settled between them like a stone finding the bottom of a clear stream. He stayed in the canyon until the sun touched the ridge, and then he rode the buckboard back to town alone, and the feed bags and the water barrels stayed behind, and the canvas shelter he had built stood against the eastern wall, like a promise made in wood and rope instead of words. 1 week later, Dallas rode out to the canyon again. He was wearing his Sunday shirt, the white one with the pearl buttons that he kept in a box under his bed for court days and funerals, and he was carrying nothing except a folded paper in his vest pocket. He had spent the week at his desk writing the paper and crossing it out and writing it again, and Cooper had watched him do it and said nothing because Cooper was young, but he wasn't stupid. He found her at the spring. The colt was standing now, putting weight on the leg, and she was washing its bandage in the clear water with the morning light catching the surface and throwing patterns on the sandstone wall behind her. Her jet black hair was loose for the first time, falling past her shoulders, straight and dark, against the white of the kimono she wore beneath the trail coat, and she wasn't wearing the trail coat now, just the kimono, deep indigo, damp at the hem where the water had touched it. She looked like a painting of a woman who had chosen to be exactly where she was, and the thought hit Dallas so hard. He stopped his horse at the mouth of the cut and sat there for a long moment before he dismounted. She stood when she saw him. The colt moved away toward the other horses, and she wiped her hands on the cloth at her waist and faced him across the spring, and this was the 4th time they had stood face to face, and the canyon was quiet around them except for the sound of the water and the grazing horses and the wind moving through the cut behind him. He didn't reach for iron. He reached into his vest and pulled out the folded paper and held it out to her across the spring. It wasn't a warrant. It was a marriage license, filled out in his handwriting, the date and the county and his name, all in the careful block letters he used for official documents, and there was a blank line where her name should go. "I have arrested you 3 times. I can't arrest you again." She looked at the paper in his hand, and she didn't move, and the spring ran between them, and the horses shifted on the slope, and the wind carried the smell of pine and cold water through the cut. "Marry me." The law can't touch a wife for her husband's property. Every horse in this canyon becomes mine. And I say they were never stolen. She crossed the spring. The water came up over her boots, and the hem of the indigo kimono darkened, and she didn't slow down. She took the paper from his hand and unfolded it and looked at the blank line where her name should go, and then she folded the paper once more, carefully, the same way she folded the blankets in his cell, and she opened the lacquered box and placed the paper inside it, the one thing she had protected through every arrest and every escape and every night in a frontier jail cell. She closed the box and the latch clicked and she placed it in his hands. Then she spoke one word, his name, Dallas. The frontier had no law for a woman who stole horses to save them from men who beat them. So the sheriff wrote one. It fit on a single page, and it changed everything it touched. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world.